2, 1.
Good evening. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us for the Adirondack Experience and the Adirondack Diversity Initiative discussion on the Black experience in the Adirondacks. My name is Dr. Terry Lindsay, Vice President for Student Affairs at Albany State University in Albany, Georgia, and I want to welcome all of you to our panel discussion. I'm joined tonight by two faith leaders from North Country congregations who will share and talk about the work their churches are doing in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. But before I get started, I want to share something I heard recently. Last week, I was listening to a speaker and he said, and I quote, "Our country has gone through many challenges in 2020. Economic challenges, health challenges, racial justice challenges, and it's easy to be overwhelmed and it's tempting to lose hope. But don't," he said. "Our country has been through challenging times in the past, but we've always figured out a way to overcome them. And while doing so, become a better and more unified nation in the end," end of quote. This evening's panel discussion is often a difficult one for many Christian leaders and congregations to address. Today, we'll hear the stories of two courageous Christian leaders, Reverend Christina Hebb and Reverend James T. Galasinski. I hope I didn't butcher your name. The goal for today is to provide an opportunity for these faith leaders who are pastoring churches in an overwhelmingly white region to discuss how and why they support Black Lives Matter, and to share examples of how their churches and other faith organizations are leading social justice work in the North Country. We're going to run tonight's program a little different than we've done in the past. Tonight, we'll have the chat function open to the audience. We would love to hear from you. Specifically, we'd like you to share, if you're comfortable, a little bit about yourself and your faith community. The chat function is for us to get to know our audience tonight. And we ask that the conversation, of course, remain respectful. However, we're requesting that the questions still get submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Questions asked in the chat function have the tendency to get missed as the chat often moves fast. In the Q&A function, you will only be able to see your own question. For example, for questions that are not addressed this evening, ADI will add more information to its website, along with a link of the recording of this evening's discussion. If you have any problems or any trouble during this live stream, feel free to post a question in the Q&A and the staff will provide guidance. Again, please direct your questions for the panelists to the Q&A function and any introduction or conversation between the attendees to the chat function. To get us started, I will ask a few questions and then I will open up for questions from the Q&A function. So here we go. So the first set of questions is for Reverend Hebb and Reverend Galasinski. And first question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your congregation?
Sure, I'll jump in first. How's that sound?
That's good.
Just to clarify, it's Reverend Kathrine Hebb, and a little bit about myself. I grew up in Colorado. in the Denver area for all the way up through college. I attended a denomination that is both fundamentalist and evangelical. And in my growing up years, the way Christianity was presented to me, I wasn't even aware that social justice was a thing. I'd never heard that term until I had graduated from college, actually. Christianity wasn't presented in a way that included justice for the poor and the oppressed. And so I've had to do a lot of shifting in my theology and in my own personal identity since the time that I was a little kid. And it's been challenging. I'll be honest with you, Dr. Lindsay. There was a point at which, moving out of my tradition from childhood, I didn't know which way was up or which way was down, or gosh, who could be trusted, or what there was to believe in.
Mm.
And it's taken time, many years, to sort of stick with reading my scriptures and learn through my experiences. I went to seminary. I graduated in 2017 from Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, which is in Rochester, New York. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. graduated from Crozer Divinity School, and we continue on with his legacy. It was really at seminary that I learned that I'm white. Let's put it that way. I had read Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography and some of his other works. I thought that I understood what racism was, and I certainly didn't fall in the category of being, racist. But the more I was challenged in seminary, taking classes on the Black church history, for example, and reading works by various African-American theologians and activists, I began to understand, wow, okay, there's this system of racism that lives in our country that I just was completely blind to up until, I was in my mid-30s. So I've been on what I call my race journey for the last probably 7 years. And I've come a long way. I know I've got a long way to go. I have made more mistakes. I have put my foot in my mouth and I have hurt people. But if there's one thing to learn from as a white person on a race journey, it's that you just have to pick yourself up and say, you know what, I'm going to make mistakes and I'm going to keep going.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but for those of us who don't know what that means, explain or define what you mean by you've been on a race journey.
Okay, that's a good question. Pretty much, I have learned that if you are a Black American living in America, you understand and discuss racism probably on a daily basis for the most part. But if you are white in America, and certainly same thing goes for, Asian Americans and Indigenous Americans and Latino and Latina Americans, same thing. Because racism is happening to them, you can't not see it in your life, and your communities discuss it all the time because you have to. It's the only way to survive it. At least that's the sense I have learned. But if you're white, you never have I don't know about you, James, but we never had any conversations about racism growing up in my house, and certainly not at church. We had the flag raising hooray for us for, Martin Luther King Day. We've come through the civil rights movement. We're past racism. Now we're a post-racial nation. And so white people just said, well, that's over, and we've moved on without recognizing the internalized racism that lives still within our systems. So whether that's governmental systems or in educational institutions, in our system of capitalism, it's, I guess when I say beginning a journey of learning about race, it's a journey of becoming aware of the world that I have existed in my whole life, but have never had eyes to see. And the process of coming into that awareness is, well, it's a little bit terrifying, to recognize that you have been blind for so much of your life, and the world that you exist in is not the world that you think exists. Yeah, so I'm still on my journey. I will always be on my journey. But I'm very, very proud to say that in my work life, in my call as a minister, racial equality work is really important for the churches that I have worked at. I think there's a picture of the Potsdam Presbyterian Church is, I think, the main picture that most folks can see. A couple years ago, we had, well, I'll talk about that in a minute, the rainbow flag out front. But yeah, that's a short, maybe not quite so short, answer to your question, Dr. Lindsay.
Well, thank you very much. James, what about you? Tell us about yourself and the congregation that you serve.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a pretty diverse urban area. I grew up Lutheran, and throughout time, I've been an Episcopalian, a Presbyterian, and finally a Unitarian Universalist. But I went to seminary in Chicago and served a congregation in Albuquerque, and now I'm here in Canton, New York, population of about 6,400 people or so. And so I have a little bit of a, urban background, and it's been a little bit difficult for me to get used to living in a small town. The congregation is about 200 members, and it's been around for since 1825. So we're approaching 200 years. Yeah. And I'll say that, theologically, I'm very out of the box theologically. One of my main inspirations is the Tao Te Ching. I read scriptures from every tradition. I really take my faith very seriously. And similar to Katrina, when I got to seminary, anti-racism and anti-racism was part of the curriculum. There was no escaping it. So I was forced to read things, and in my ordination process, being anti-racist and being anti-oppression, being well-versed in anti-oppression was part of being ordained. You couldn't be ordained if you were not competent in those areas. And, similar to Katrina, I was like, well, I'm not racist. I'm not racist. And, when you're taking some classes, you're doing some readings and doing these workshops, and you're really examining your own soul, your own family of origin, and you're realizing, oh, my dad used to say this. Oh, actually, I am racist. And I've done racist things, and I've hurt people. And I really believe my faith is an anti-racist faith. You can call it sin or whatever you want to call it. But to me, part of my faith is calling me, urging me, luring me to be anti-racist. I'll stop there. How's that?
All right. Well, well said. Well said. So let's jump into the next question. This is a good one. So as a faith leader, how have you supported social justice movements in the past? You started to talk about that, but I want you to elaborate on it. So how have you supported social justice movement in the past? And has your congregation always been actively engaged in social justice movement? James, why don't we start with you first this time?
Sure. I think part of the nature or just the makeup of Unitarian Universalists, there's a lot of activists. We're just people that we're better at doing than we are at being sometimes. And we're constantly doing stuff. And actually the really interesting history of this particular congregation is we helped start St. Lawrence University back in the 1850s. And we ordained a woman in 1863. So there, I'm just saying that not to brag or anything, but just that we have a whole history of engaging in social justice work. Personally, I've been involved in a lot of different, movements. I think one of the things, again, seminary made me do things to get out of my comfort zone. So I had to actually work. Well, I was a volunteer, a long-term volunteer in a homeless shelter in Milwaukee. And so I saw daily people coming in, getting out of jail and having nothing and going to a homeless shelter. And these were predominantly people of color. And you start putting things together, and I got very interested in prison reform. And we had a conference here about a year and a half ago on prison reform. And so there's a lot of different things that we've been involved in, but I just giving you a taste of things.
Okay. What about you, Kathrine?
There are two ways to answer this question. There's sort of the hard skills related to advocacy work, and then there's what I call more the soft skills end of things. And I started going to protests, I think when I was in college, probably I was like 21, and making phone calls and sending letters related to various bills and people running for elected offices. So there's sort of that end of advocacy work, but then there's also these relational building pieces that I think that are so important, and that white people, we miss the value of them when we're doing social justice work. And those are things like joining groups that are run by people of color, and just showing up, really, surrounding yourself in environments where white people are not the majority, and seeking to make friends with people that don't look like you. Like James, I got involved. Well, no, probably the better way to say it is I became friends with a group of veterans who are inmates at Attica Correctional Facility a couple years ago. And I got involved personally in the work that they do there. And I would go and I would visit on a regular basis. And building those relational foundations is a key part, at least in my opinion, of what it means to support social justice movements. And if you don't have those relationship parts that fit together with the advocacy work, if white people just live in their white bubble, if it's making phone calls and sending letters and doing that kind of work and going to protests, but if we stay in our white bubble, we're missing out on kind of the whole point of this racial justice work. So yeah, in my work, both as a minister and just with me personally, I've gotten involved in groups that are
Yeah.
doing work. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing. The next question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to see what we have in our Q&A function area. The next question I'm going to ask is going to probe a little bit more beyond just social justice. I'm going to dig into a specific movement, but I want to say what I have noticed is that a lot of Christian leaders have struggled with this thing called Black Lives Matter. And particularly, if I'm going to be honest, white Christian leaders, but not just white Christian leaders, all Christian leaders, but white Christian leaders have really struggled with Black Lives Matter or the Black Lives Matter movement. Why did you feel that it was important to support Black Lives Matter? And Kathrine, I want to start with you.
Okay. Well, we'll start with the most important point, which is that in my experience, God and in my study of the Bible, God calls us to this social justice work. God is squarely on the side of the poor and the oppressed all throughout, whether you're reading the Hebrew scriptures or the New Testament scriptures. And so even though we don't live in the world that Jesus lived in, we don't live in a vacuum, and we live inside of a historical structure. And if we believe that God is present in all ages, then we have to ask ourselves, who exactly in our context would Jesus be welcoming in and including and accepting? And so in our American experience, they're really specific people that, well, at least in my opinion, they're really specific groups of people that I feel God does hone in on, with a special soft spot in God's heart. And that's going to be for Black Americans who have lived through slavery and racism for the last 400 years. It's going to include Indigenous people and Latino and Latina folks. It's going to include the poor and the disabled. It's going to include women and folks who belong to the LGBTQ community. And I guess that's why the Black Lives Matter movement is important to me to support. It's the largest Black advocacy group. And again, as a white person coming into this racial work, it's really important that I come in as a participant who follows the leadership of people of color, and particularly of Black folks and Black women. And I'll pinpoint that specifically. And that's exactly what Black Lives Matter is. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it is that Black Lives Matter the movement has been targeted and persecuted terribly, and because of the racism in America. And so if I, as a white person, am going to ask myself, where is my best energy going to be put? And who needs backing the most from people who look like me? And are there other really great advocacy groups out there run by Black folks? Absolutely, positively. But this one in particular feels really important to support. And it just so happens that we have a really active BLM group in Potsdam, New York. So that's why I choose to stand where I stand.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to wait until after James gives his response. But James, what about you?
Well, I think, in short, Black Lives Matter, as a white person, Black Lives Matter, of course, and I want to make a distinction too. Katrina, was talking about the movement. There also is like the slogan, Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
And boy, it really hurts when I hear people say things that if you want to be against some of the parts of the movement, or you don't agree with this policy, that's fine. But it really hurts, I think, when people say all lives matter, or they try to direct the conversation into a different way. But so there is a slogan and there's a movement. You can go to their website and you can look at some of the things they stand for and what kind of policy changes they want. Being part of Black Lives Matter for me is being active in the wider community, a sort of collective liberation. It goes beyond me. It's not about me as an individual. And at the same time, Black Lives Matter and being involved in it has forced me to liberate my own soul, to become freer. Being involved in the Black Lives Matter movement has enabled me to do the soul work, to expand my own heart, to include more love. That's why I'm in it. I'm in it because, I'm not in it. I mean, I am in it because I want to help people or whatever, but I'm in it because I need it. I need the liberation myself inwardly. That's why I'm doing it. Maybe that's too selfish, or I don't know.
Well, it's honest, and
it's honest.
It's honest. Thank you, James. Hey, let's switch briefly and go to some questions for from the Q&A function. The first question, I won't read the name of the person, but the first question is, and I'll read it. Have you studied a foreign language or culture? Have you stepped outside your own comfort zone to learn about any other, in addition to people of other races or experience or culture? So have you studied a foreign culture, and have you stepped outside your own race? And the answer, based on all that you've been saying, is yes. But talk specifically about what the questioner labeled as a foreign culture. Katrina, why don't we start with you?
So to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister, we actually have to study both ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew. And I think learning other languages is really helpful in sort of stretching our minds to be able to even imagine that there are different ways of thinking in the world. That there are different ways of structuring how words are communicated grammatically. And I know that sounds really technical, but it's really helpful to have to be forced to think in a different structure and communicate in a different structure than the one that you have assumed your whole life is, what we would call normal. It sort of blasts out the walls of that word normal. And you realize, oh, there's more going on in the world. There's more ways to think. There's more ways to speak and talk and communicate than the way that I do. I've been very fortunate to have a couple experiences going far away. So whether I spent some time in France when I was in high school, and about 12 years ago, I spent a month in Malawi, which is a really tiny country in Southeastern Africa. And that's what most people think of when you think of going to study a foreign culture. My race work here in America has helped me to see that you don't have to leave the borders of our country. You don't even have to leave the borders of your city or your town to experience foreign culture. We have a large Amish community in the Potsdam area. That's a foreign culture, right? Even It was very eye-opening to me to realize that what I thought of as just normal American culture is actually white American culture, and even more than that, white middle class American culture, and even more than that, white middle class Protestant American culture. The more
With
I,
some patriarchy thrown in.
yeah, of course, make sure we address that. You know, when I started making friends with people who don't look like me, I started to recognize that there are so many different ways to be American. There's a, you know, there are many different types of Black culture, just as many subsets as I just listed, but Black culture, on the whole, is very different than white culture in some ways. Um, and that was a real waking up moment for me to realize, oh, my way of living in America is not the only way to be American. So yes, I guess that's the long answer to the participants' question.
Good, thank you. James, what about you? And there are a number of really good questions. So one in the chat room, although I think we were supposed to put it in Q&A, but that's okay. One in the chat room and a couple in Q&A. So I want to get to those questions. But James, you're up next.
Sure. I mean, ich spreche Deutsch ein bisschen. So I speak German a little bit. My wife is from Germany, and you know, I have 2 children that are bilingual. I wouldn't call myself fluent in German, but I have studied it, and I've been to Germany a bunch of times, and you know, I've also spent some time in Tanzania. I have a passport, and I like, before COVID-19, you know, I tried to travel a lot, but you know, I do want to echo what Kathrine said, that even in the North Country here, where I don't know what the percentage is, 94% white or something like that. I'm a campus minister at SUNY Canton. SUNY Canton has a huge, diverse student population. I spend a lot of time there. I take my son to eat lunch there, you know, again, pre-COVID. I've befriended people at the mosque. I mean, you think, you know, like I said, 94% white, you go to the mosque and it's like United Nations there. I mean, there's people from every country. Yeah. and it's crazy. And those experiences I cherish, but I also cherish, you know, one spring break in when I was an undergraduate, you know, a lot of people were going to, you know, Florida or whatever, going to for spring break. And I was involved in campus ministry. And we said, we're going to do like a home or city spring break. And we're going to volunteer at local organizations. So we went to clothing, you know, homeless shelters and soup kitchens and all this stuff in our, you know, miles from where I was going, you know, and then people are going on these trips halfway across the world to Africa and, you know, different parts of the world. But like Kathrine said, so a lot of this is in your backyard.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
The next question comes from an audience member, but it's actually a follow-up question I was going to ask. So let's dive right into it. So the question is, and I'm going to ask you to go first, James. How are each of your congregation responding to your passion for social justice? How were they responding to you, man?
I would say, okay, so I've been here, this is my 5th year here. And I would say that they're taking to my leadership. They are, I think one of the things I notice, this is kind of cool, when I preach a sermon, whatever topic it's on, I hear people talking about it and repeating phrases from it. I know people are listening. I know that I'm respected. And I think when I came in, well, okay, so when I came here, it was August 2016. If you remember 2016, there was a number of Black people killed by police officers, and it was a hot topic. And I came in new, and I didn't know what to do or how to go about. And I had been involved in the Black Lives Matter movement since my seminary days in Chicago. And what do I do up here? Well, like Kathrine said, the first thing you do is you meet people and build relationships. And then, you know, people came to me because our church has a reputation of being active in the community. What is your congregation doing about the Black Lives Matter movement? And to me, that was like the light bulb went on. I was like, yeah, we should be doing something. And, you know, you preach a couple sermons, you talk it up, and people are like, yeah, you're right. And our congregation in 2016 voted to support the movement. And shortly after, we put up a big sign that the historic village didn't really like because it had too many colors. So we had to get a new sign. But you know, shortly after that, there was a group for a while that was active in the North Country called Surge. It was showing up for racial justice. They were meeting in our congregation, and people in our congregation were, you know, leaders in this movement, and things started to snowball from there.
Let me push the envelope a little bit,
Yeah.
James. Did you lose any members
No,
because of your support for Black Lives Matter?
no.
What about you, Katrina?
My
How did your church respond to you, and did you
Right.
lose any members?
So my situation is a little bit different than James. I started my first day of my new call at the Potsdam Presbyterian Church, March 9th of 2020. So that was 4 days before the pandemic really hit. And I have yet to actually meet in person my entire congregation. So I'm kind of coming in a, well, in a really funky situation, really. My church had started its racial transformation, and I think I can use that term. Before I got there, actually, one of the questions that they had for potential new hires was, how would you continue to lead us in our racial justice activities? So they were looking for someone like me to begin with. But in that process of beginning that transformation, our church has lost members, and not necessarily specifically around racial justice issues. But I know in the last 5 years, questions of inclusion of LGBT folks had become a really divisive topic. And between that and some other things that were going on in the church, we lost half of our membership. And you take a real blow when half of your people decide that they can no longer worship and serve in the body of Christ in your congregation. So we're down to the bare bones right now. And to be honest, I don't entirely know how everyone in my congregation has taken to, I mean, I was out the first day at the first Black Lives Matter march, which was June 1st. That was the day that right after oh my gosh, George, I can't believe I just forgot his last
George
name.
Floyd.
Thank you. Flew out of my brain. Had died. And, you know, I've been down, we have daily rallies in Potsdam, New York. All summer they were from 6 to 7 p.m. down at the post office. And now they are at the post office from 4 to 4:30. Every single day of the week, we have had at least one rally since June 1st under the leadership of Jen Backstrom, who is our fearless leader. And I've been down there, and you know, I'm vocal about that. I've prayed prayers at some of these rallies, public prayers, and have ended up in the newspaper. Most of my congregants, I think, are supportive of that and appreciate my willingness to be sort of out on the front lines. But I think I would be lying to say that all of my congregants appreciate my vocal stance. And there is some tension. And that is the hard place to live in, right? It's how do you live out your truth while also serving a congregation of people who are made up of more than one voice, and live by more than one persuasion, and follow more than one theology? And how do you walk that line? And where do you choose to draw the line? I mean, these are questions you have to deal with every day. If I'm being honest, I have preached some sermons that I was terrified to preach. And afterwards I asked.
Good for you. Good for you.
So
Those are the best ones.
Yeah, maybe not while you're preaching them, right? Because you're scared to death. Like, am I gonna get sacked for doing this? And but James, you're absolutely right. Those are the sermons that then become the sort of stepping stone from which we jump from, or maybe a lily pad from this pad to the next one. And the more you talk about racism and racial justice, the more we normalize the conversation, and the more we as leaders give our congregants permission to have these same conversations at home, around the dinner table, which, to be quite frank, Dr. Lindsay, I don't know how long it's been since you've had, Thanksgiving dinner around a white table, but we don't talk about racism. It's the big taboo subject. And and also I think Alexis just put up, so we have a sign out front, and this summer during the pandemic, just to be lighthearted, I started changing the sign every week with mostly silly jokes, up until the time when George Floyd was killed. And then I realized this is another vehicle we have for speaking to racism in our community. So again, I've made sure that we don't do it every week, talking about racism on our signs, but they're out there. And sometimes I don't think everyone's totally supportive of the racial justice messages that we're putting out there.
James, before I get to you, I'll get to you in a second, but I want to, if you don't mind, James, I want to do a follow-up question to Kathrine, because it's a question that came from someone in the audience. This is someone who, I'm guessing, please forgive me if I'm incorrect about this, but I'm guessing passionate about these issues and want to start conversations with church members about racial justice issues, but perhaps are in a congregation that's a little resistant to this. What advice, Kathrine?
That's a really good question. I mean, this is the rub. This is where so many white Americans who look like me, we get stuck, right? Because the culture around us does not facilitate these conversations. It does not welcome these conversations. They're not hospitable to these conversations. And the best advice I can give is to use your ignorance as a tool, especially in congregations. Invite people to have a book group discussion.
Good one. Yeah.
Around books on racism. And you don't have to know everything in that book. You don't have to know all of the answers. And in fact, it actually works to your advantage to not know all of the answers, because then you are in the learning process with everyone else in your group. finding these little ways, and it takes courage. I cannot stress that enough. You have to step out of your comfort zone, and it's not enjoyable. You're going to be scared. You're going to be terrified that you're going to step on people's toes. You're going to be afraid that people are going to be offended. And the reason you're afraid is because they will be. Not all of them, but some of them. And you have to be willing to say it's worth this risk, even though I'm going to experience being uncomfortable. And even though I'm going to make other people around me uncomfortable. The goal of racial equality work is inadvertently to make us all uncomfortable, to push these conversations to places where we're not willing to go. But yes, there are some maybe some tricks to the trade, and one of them would be to, and I think James has an idea also.
Yeah.
Then jump on in, my friend.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've done over the years here is 2 or 3 times a year, I offer a class, a 4-part class that meets, I think, 90 minutes each. It's called Let's Talk About Race, and it's based on a couple books that I've read, but it's, again, about 12 people, which is, you don't want to be more than that, maybe 8, 9. And these are church members, people that know each other, people that feel comfortable with each other. And, the first session is sort of like, oh, let's get comfortable a little bit with each other and let's talk about our backgrounds, and then let's throw out some definitions of what white supremacy culture is, what what white fragility is, and let's talk about this. And then but let's talk about it not on an intellectual level. Let's talk about our experience. How have we, and then by the 4th class, people are saying, yeah, when I was visiting my friend in Boston, and I stepped on the subway and everyone in was black, and I clutched my purse, and but a light bulb went on. I'm like, oh, or like they were able to have this dialogue because of the class we had. They're like, oh, I'm recognizing these biases and these internal things happening. So I'm a big believer in small group, just talking about it, just getting together. And then what I did too for the fourth class, I say, well, what are we going to do now? And then sometimes there's a good idea, sometimes something never happens, but sometimes it's like, well, we can, organize people to go watch this movie together, the 13 movie, or whatever. Yeah. So little steps, baby steps.
Yeah. James, let me follow up. Excellent idea, man. Would you bring in your congregation together to do these classes around race? Would you ever consider offering those sessions, just open sessions, so to Christian, not just leaders, but Christian members across the North Country who might want to participate in a session like you're suggesting around race? Would you ever consider doing that?
Yes. I've kind of tried to, but I didn't know who to contact, and but I would love to do that. Yeah, and it would be easy on Zoom.
So now you have an organization. The Adirondack Diversity Initiative might be the organization you might want to work through to offer a class like this, open to faith leaders, or just lay person, or anyone who wants to come together to talk about issues of racial injustice, or unconscious bias, or anti-racism, or any of these topics that we have often struggled with. So I hope they'll either reach out to you, or you'll reach out to them. Let's pivot a little bit. And we're running out of time, so we couple of more questions. Talk a little bit about organizations that you have partnered with. Have you partnered with other organizations, either across the North Country or anywhere, to deal with and wrestle with issues around social justice? Katrina, why don't we start? No, James, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'll say this, that then in previous congregations that I've been a part of, it was much easier to find organizations to partner with, because I could build a relationship with the Black minister at the AME church, and we could like do a project together. And at least to my knowledge, there's not a Black church here. And actually, I mentioned before the Surge group showing up for racial justice. One of the parts of the program was to have an outside organization of run by people of color to be your like accountability partner. And one of the things is we couldn't find an organization locally to do that. And it can be frustrating. I'm speaking of here in the North Country.
Yeah, there's I'm trying to think of his name, but it's slipping me. There's a young man who works at SUNY Potsdam, who does a lot of great diversity work, works out of the diversity office there. That might be a really good person to partner with. There's also a woman who's, believe she's the vice president for institutional diversity. I can't think of either of their names right now, but those are probably fantastic individuals to partner with if you're looking for a partner. Katrina, what about you?
So again, I've only been here since March and walked straight into the pandemic, but I am so proud to say that my church has been able to co-host a couple of events with the Black Lives Matter of Potsdam. Yeah, Jen Backstrom came to me earlier in the summer and said, hey, I just found out that a local historian named Brian Thompson has done lecture series on the history of the KKK in the North Country in St. Lawrence County. Can we get him to come and do this lecture at your church? Because, they don't have a building, they don't have those sort of structural resources, and we do. So we did. We held the first was an outdoor event, and Brian came. I think we had, again, this is in pandemic life, but we had 100 people show up out on the lawn of the church with their masks on and, social distancing in their pods. We co-hosted this thing with Brian started, he did his historical perspective, and then Dr. John Youngblood, who is, he's, a communications professor, I think.
Yeah, at SUNY Potsdam. Yeah.
At Potsdam, a Black man, take what Brian Thompson had talked about in the history and then made connections to our current situation. So that was the first of the two. And then the second one, of course, it was getting cold and dark, so we moved it inside and put it online. The second event was Brian Thompson doing a history of the Anti-Slavery Society in St. Lawrence County and the Underground Railroad. And same thing, both Dr. Youngblood and Jen Backstrom of BLM made connections between what we were learning about in our history to this present moment. And that's really, when we make these relational connections is when we are actually fleshing out racial justice. Not just the event itself, but the relating that happens is part of the work. And it's really exciting. We're also involved in, it's called the Potsdam Interfaith Community. And that's the whole gamut of faith congregations in Potsdam, from the synagogue, and we're there, and the Church of the Nazarene, and the Methodists, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the mosque and the Christian Scientists and the Catholics. And that's been a really humbling experience to realize that that we're not the first to do this. I mean, this group has been going, I think someone said, for 25 years. And so if you look, you can find relationships already established. And there's always room to forge new alliances and new relationships.
Yeah. Thank you. James, it looked like you had a follow-up comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I also partner with clergy in Canton and in Potsdam. I mean, Kathrine and I have partnered on things. Although I'll tell you the truth, I mean, a lot of clergy are resistant to Black Lives Matter, like you said earlier, Terry. So I've been more like selective of who I want to work with, you know. And the other thing I was going to mention, it totally slipped my mind, but we've been partnering with the Poor People's Campaign, which has a North Country chapter, which is sort of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King's last movement. And we've been actually partnering with them to have events and other things throughout the last couple of years.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. This is our last question. James, I'm going to go to you first. What's next, buddy? What future actions do you have planned to continue to support Black Lives Matter? And if folks in the audience or across the North Country want to get in touch with you, how can they get involved? Or if they want to get involved with something you're doing, how can they get involved? What do you want to tell them?
Well, first off, we do have the privilege of having a social justice coordinator at our congregation. So I would probably put you in contact with her, and right now we've been focusing on getting out the vote in general, a nonpartisan way. And I think in January we're going to do more small groups, and one of the groups is going to be racial justice work. And that you can contact me at minister@uucantony.org. Someone could maybe put that in the chat, or I can. And then what was the first part of the question, Terry?
No, I was just asking what future action activities do you have planned to support Black Lives Matter? Right.
So again, one of the things we're going to do, I briefly mentioned the Poor People's Campaign. We're going to vote on that as a congregation to become a formal partner with them, because we have a lot of mutual, uucantony.org, by the way. We have a lot of similar principles and values. I'm sort of, why don't you go, Kathrine? I'm still kind of ruminating.
Yeah. Right now, it feels like we just hold steady with what we're doing. You know, just to show up at BLM rallies and be a part of what the Black leadership in Potsdam is asking of us.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm almost every week am down at the post office on Wednesdays and Fridays. And so now from 4 to 4:30, you could find me there. You know, I put my email address in the chat bar. Feel free to email me or call the church. We'd love to have you come join us. And I guess to answer your question more specifically, right now, it needs to grow organically, I think. And again, be led by the relationships that have been formed out of the work that we're already doing. And I
want to reiterate that it's not like us, it's not Kathrine and I, charging ahead. We're at, like, exactly like she said, we're paying attention to Jen and John and other people in the community. And I wanted to add, I just want to talk a little general, like Kathrine and I have been involved in a little bit underground organizing because a group of people of color in the area fear for their lives, that there may be some violence from white militias or whatever that Trump may kind of instigate. And we're just doing some background organizing because they have, I mean, there's a lot of fears out there, and history shows us that they have, I mean, the fears are legit.
Anything, I don't know if you were, did you want to say anything else, Katrina?
Just that I guess I imagine that the work in the future will certainly involve students, either at Clarkson or SUNY Potsdam. I hope that after the pandemic is over, that we'll be able to make more connections with students and follow their leadership. Part of showing up and being part of this movement as a white person is being a participant and being a follower of other folks who are already doing this work before us. So it's, yeah, I'm really excited for what is to come in the future, which we just get to know what it is yet.
Yeah. I want to end by putting a little plug in and encourage both of you to, if you're moved, to reach out to this group. I served for many years as the Vice President for Student Affairs at a small little college in Paul Smith's College. And there are some terrific and amazing students, faculty, and staff who are committed to social justice work and are committed to a lot of the things that you talked about tonight. So if you ever get a chance to reach out to those students and to reach out to that institution, you have some folks who are eager to be part of what you're doing. Folks, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. These conversations are tough. They're scary. And as both James and Katrina said, they can sometimes be uncomfortable, but they're the right thing to do. And it's the Jesus thing to do, as Katrina said. Yeah. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. I encourage you to keep involved in conversation wherever you can find them. Stay engaged in these kinds of conversation. It will allow you to grow, to learn a lot about yourself, to do some good work. And I know, having lived in Paul Smith's, there are pockets of places all over Saranac Lake and Lake Placid, Tupper Lake, where people are doing amazing work. Find some of those folks, and obviously in SUNY Canton and in Potsdam, in Canton and Potsdam. Find those individuals, find those organizations, and get involved. People are yearning, eager to have authentic conversations about these issues. So we thank you. God bless you. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. We thank you for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful night and good evening. Thank you, everyone.